Okay, so we are starting a new unit, and this unit is something that has a couple topics that I think you may or may not know. They sound like good, deep, abstract philosophical terms, but they're epistemology and metaphysics. And we're going to talk about what that means and why this is a separate unit in just a second. First thing I want to do, though, the readings in this section are very abstract. Okay. Just like I know the Kant reading was very abstract, the readings in this one are going to be a little bit of a challenge. So I've done a couple things. First, I shortened the first reading that has a lot of stuff in it that is useful and is actually part of Hume's argument, but that you don't really need to know the first time you've gone through. So take a look at the announcement and on the course page where I laid that out. One other thing I'm actually going to suggest, because I know lots of people use it now anyway, but AI is a powerful tool to help you learn, not just a powerful tool to help you get around learning. They call that cognitive offloading nowadays. When if you ask it to just sort of tell you what it is, what the answer is to something, or Lord forbid you just put in an AI and say, write my paper for me or something like that. But there are some really strong ways to use it that are incredibly helpful that I use myself. Really, the best tip, if I have any tip that I can give you about how to use all the AI chatbots that are out there now, um, is to put some effort into your prompts. And what I mean by effort, especially when it comes to difficult readings, is instead of just saying, hey, summarize this for me, it's better if you can do something like, I think this reading is saying X, or we have to read Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding. I think Hume is arguing X, and take a second to write out what you think he's saying. And then be like, is that right? And what's going to happen is they're going to give you some back and forth that will actually help you see what parts you did understand and what parts you maybe didn't understand. Doing something like that and treating the AI like a conversation partner, you're going to learn a lot just from a couple back and forths with that, just to really see, okay, what did I pick up from this and what did I not pick up from this? That's true both from the readings, but also when you're studying. That's a good way to use AI to sort of test yourself, not just to say, hey, give me some practice questions, which you can do, but it's even better to take a minute and actually write out an idea or two and say, is this right? Am I getting this? Or is there a better way to do it? Um, and so, really, a really good way to do it is when you're dealing with readings that are not copyrighted. That's one trick. I certainly cannot tell you to upload copyrighted material. But when you're dealing with readings that are in the public domain, like Hume's is, because it's from the 1700s, so you can certainly upload it. You can upload a whole passage and really argue. I think he's arguing this, but could you point me to a passage in this where he says something that's better, or something like that, something like I've got on the screen. Those are just much more productive ways to use AI to really help yourself learn and to break down difficult material rather than just having it do the work for you of say, hey, here's my reading, give me the top 5 points or something, which, you can do that. You're certainly not going to really ingest anything from that. It's just creating a cheat sheet. So, one thing I am going to do with this one is I'll find a good copyable piece of the readings of the main parts, and I'll put that up on the page for this week so that you've got that. Just because I think that's a useful exercise to try. I'm still looking into maybe doing something like that for some of our later discussion boards. I got to make sure that it works with free versions because I certainly am not going to require anyone to be paying for ChatGPT or things like that. I will say though, when it comes to philosophy, the one that is by far hands down better than the other ones is Claude. So by Anthropic. ChatGPT and Gemini and Copilot are fine for getting a kind of good overview of things, but to really understand something, right now Claude is probably the one that has the best text material. And we're going to actually look at some things with AI later on. And personally, I'm fascinated by what they're capable of. But I do know there is a real temptation to, as they say, offload a ton of cognitive work onto AI. And I think one thing that's going to happen in the future, just not that you asked for my prediction, but what the heck, I'll give it, is that in the long run, AI isn't going to replace people, but the people who are best able to use it intelligently are going to be the ones who come out on top. So it's a good idea to start thinking about what are the ways I can use this to really help me understand things rather than using it as shortcuts. Because I think in the long run, you're going to see a split between the people who use it intelligently and the people who use it for shortcuts. And if you've always been focused on being a good student, using it intelligently is something that you want to start practicing now. So, okay, all that to the side. Let's talk about this next unit and what the two major questions we're going to focus on are. So, metaphysics and epistemology. What we're really talking about in this unit is how to figure out what's real. Okay, that's the one thing that these two topics, these two branches of philosophy, metaphysics and epistemology, have in common. They both deal with what's real. They just do it in different ways. First, we have metaphysics. And metaphysics is really just the straight up study of what is really real. Okay, what actually exists, what things are just illusions or stories or approximations of things or even images, but what is reality itself? That's a good metaphysical question. Some of you may know the term metaphysics from like if you go to a bookstore, there's often a metaphysical section, which usually means like sort of new age and spiritual things and maybe even occult things like tarot cards or things like that. That's not what we're talking about metaphysics when we're in philosophy. Metaphysics really just means the word itself means meta slash physics, beyond physics. So, what is underneath or what is beyond the real world? What's really real? That could just be physical things, that could be intellectual things. Lots of different philosophers have had lots of different answers to what is really real when all things are said and done. But that's metaphysics. Epistemology is technically the study of how do we know things. But it's tied to reality because epistemology is about how do we actually know the things that we think are true, the things that we think are real. How can we guarantee that the things that we think are real are actually real? How do we know for a fact, know for certain that certain things are real? And how do we know what's actually outside of our heads? How do we know that we're not just like Descartes had, where we're all just sort of experiencing illusions or a simulation of the world? How do we know that the things behind our senses and the things behind our thoughts really are real, or that that's the way that they really are? Those are really the two central questions. So we're going to look at a number of questions and problems in both metaphysics and epistemology in this unit. But I wanted to start off with to give you some more good philosophical vocabulary about what are these two terms, metaphysics and epistemology. And really, the words just break down. Metaphysics means what is beyond just the physical world, if there is anything beyond just the physical world. And epistemology, episteme means thinking or mind, and epistemology just means the study of thinking or the study of the mind. How do we know, what we think we know, or what is thinking? Those are the two. They're really both about reality, just kind of coming at it from different directions. Okay, so that's the whole unit. And what we're going to start with is David Hume. Because Hume is a modern philosopher from the 18th century, from the 1700s, but he created a bunch of questions or sort of articulated a bunch of questions that a lot of people think are still really central, difficult questions, difficult philosophical questions. He was a Scottish philosopher, which is nice that we can actually read what he wrote in without being in translation. The actual words that you're reading are the actual words that he wrote. What he wrote were from the 1740s, so this is from a while back. All right, so some of the examples he uses are obviously he's not going to be talking about social media or anything like that. But Hume was a skeptic. And what we mean by a skeptic in this case is that he actually didn't think that in the end we could actually know what was really real. Okay, so he comes at things looking at some problems with how we say we know the world around us. And that's important because what we're going to start with are a couple skeptical questions of how do we actually know what's going on in the world around us? Similar to how Descartes tried to raise that question. But Hume's going to point out a couple different problems that everybody who just has to live has to answer in certain ways. And he thought we did still live. He didn't think that we don't know the real world and so that therefore we're all just stuck doubting all the time. He actually pointed out, no, we get along just fine even without knowing for a fact what is really real all around us. That's not the question. The question is more just like how do we actually what's the basis we have for believing what we say we believe? Those are really the questions he's going to ask. And we're going to look at a couple particular ones. And really, in all of this that we're looking at this time, all of the readings, I want to point out the title of what he wrote was called An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. What he's really doing is pointing out a bunch of questions that he thinks about how human beings understand the world around them and some things that we're justified in believing, and some things that he thinks we're not justified in believing. And we're gonna get into those questions here in just a little bit. So that's why this reading is called An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Another way to think about it would be like some questions about human understanding. That's really what he's writing about. Um, so what we're going to start with are what Hume starts with. And he starts by saying, look, anything that we know, anything that's in our head, really falls into one of two categories. And these are the only two categories of things that are in our head. There are impressions and there are ideas. And we're going to look at these two things right now. So he makes a distinction between those two things. First, there are impressions. And what are impressions to Hume? He means are direct, immediate experiences. Okay, that could be things like actual senses, the actual visions we see, the actual sounds that we hear, the actual things that we touch, the feelings that we actually have. Um, so that would be like the actual sensation of heat when you touch something hot. That would be the actual taste of food when you eat it. But it also, for him, would be like the actual feeling of being angry or sad or excited right now in the moment. That feeling that you actually have. And these things are very vivid. They're very powerful because they're happening to you right now. Impressions are really the kind of things that Descartes would say you cannot doubt that you're having. When you look at something, you can't doubt that you are having an impression of something. You might be able to doubt that what you're seeing is real, whether or not that image that you're seeing with your eyes is a hallucination or not, or a dream or not. But you can't doubt that you're actually seeing something. Like that's just that's a fact of sensation that when you're experiencing these things, you know you are experiencing something, period. Any of those things are going to be impressions. Okay? For Hume's term, impressions are what those are. At the same time, we have ideas. And ideas are, for Hume, he means not just a thought, but they're really anything that you have left over after an experience is done. So that would be the memory of that heat, or the memory that you have, the thought of that food that you had when you were eating it, the recollection of being angry that you had once you calmed down. So ideas are like a copy or an echo of the original experience, but they're a little dimmer. They're less vivid. You could also think about it as an impression is the thing that you feel, but the idea is the thing that you talk about later that you have. It's sort of like your idea of that feeling that you had. And ultimately, when you break it down, Hume says that those are the only two things really in our head are either impressions or ideas. Those are the two things that go on in mental space in one way or another. We're either experiencing something immediately or we're dealing with ideas or thoughts or memories about impressions. And everything else that goes on in our head is really, he wants to say, connections and ideas that are built up of other ideas, of related ideas. Um, so, and Hume's really big claim here, the thing that he really wants to point out, is that every idea that you have can be traced back in one way or another to some impression that you had first. So really, your mind can do all kinds of creative things. It can create and combine ideas in new ways. Like you can imagine a golden mountain that you've never seen before, because at some point you'll have seen something gold and you'll have seen mountains, and your mind can put those two ideas together. So you can imagine things, but Hume would want to say you can't actually imagine things that you've never had any impression of before. So, for example, he would say, imagine a color you've never seen. Well, I could say that word, but can I really imagine a color that I I couldn't actually see? And Hume would say, really can't. You might be able to imagine a color between certain colors. Like if you look at two colors of blue, you might be able to imagine, or two shades of blue, you might be able to imagine a color that's somewhere between those two. But that's a little different from saying imagine a color that's not red, green, blue, yellow, orange, purple, right? Imagine a color that's different. And he's going to say you can't really do it. You can only ultimately imagine things, or think of things that in one way or another can be tied back to impressions. Okay, so impressions ultimately are the raw ingredients of any idea that we ultimately have. So you can't have a genuine idea of something you've had absolutely no experience of, either directly or indirectly. Um, and so we can imagine things or have ideas of things that we've never experienced before directly, but they're always tied to other things that we have experienced directly. Okay. He mentions the one interesting exception about the color shade that you could imagine, like filling in a gap. But that's really the only exception, he says. Otherwise, everything he thinks has to have gone back to some impression, or really be like an analogy to an impression that you've had. So why does any of this matter? Okay, so ultimately, it's going to matter because Hume's going to use this idea as a test for whether or not we can actually say something is conceivable. So if someone claims to have an idea of something, Hume's going to want to ask, ultimately, what was the experience that produced that idea? And if there was no experience, that idea might be empty. It might just be made up words. And so he'll want to say, like, like maybe it may just be a word that sounds meaningful or that seems like it makes sense, but it doesn't actually refer to anything actually real. And he's going to apply this as a test in a big way in just a little bit. But that's really the basic reason why he introduces this, is to say, look, anything that makes sense has to have come either from an impression or be an idea, which is like ultimately a memory of an idea. Ultimately, Hume is what's called an empiricist in the long run. And an empiricist is someone who says that all of our ideas, ultimately, anything that we know, has to have at some point come from experience. There's nothing that we can say that we know that we can't tie ultimately back to some experience. That's what an empiricist is. Um, and the opposite of an empiricist would be a rationalist. And a rationalist would say, well, no, there are some things that you can imagine that just make sense. And that because they make sense, you can imagine them without there being an experience there. But Hume would ultimately say, no, even things you think you may just be thinking of, you're ultimately tying it back to some experience that you've had in one way or another. Even math. Math, as abstract as it is, he would say we get the idea of math from specific things. Like when we talk about number, for example, Hume would say even things like number are ultimately tied back to our experience of one thing and two things. Like, I mean, I've got a mouse and a phone. Like the number two, ultimately, I can trace back to having an experience of two things in front of me. And I can build on that maybe and say four would be if I imagine seeing not just these two things, but these two and another two. But ultimately, it's tied back to experience. It's got to be tied back to experience in one way or another for Hume. Okay, so that's the reason why this is so important. Is ultimately he's going to say anything that we say we know has to be tied to those impressions in one way or another. Okay? Um, so that leads to the next point he's going to try to make, which is that there are really only two kinds of knowledge for Hume. Okay, we've got the two sorts of ideas in our head, the impressions and the ideas, or the two contents in our head. But there's also, Hume's going to say, really only two kinds of knowledge, which are tied to these two impressions and ideas. And the first is what he's going to call relations of ideas. Okay. And this is the world of mathematics and logic. So if I tell you that the angles in a triangle, for example, always add up to 180 degrees, or that 3 times 5 always equals 15, those are things that are true no matter what. Right? You don't have to go out and measure all the triangles in the world in order to know that the angles will always add up to 180 degrees. You don't have to go out and count every 3 times 5 groups of things in order to know that it's 15. These are things that are true by the logic of the concepts themselves. Almost they're true literally by definition, and their opposite is literally impossible. Okay, so there is no world in which 3 times 5 equals 16. It's just that's not a thing that we can conceive of. We can say those words, but what would that actually mean? That 3 times 5 equals 16. There's no way it can actually mean anything, Hume would say. So we have those, we have relations of ideas, but those ideas, remember, are ultimately tied to specific things. But still, by definition, there are certain things that we can say we know. But then the second kind of thing he calls matters of fact. And these are claims about how the world actually is, about things that we directly experience. And the only way to know these things is through experience. Okay? We know, for example, that the sun rose this morning. I saw it. We know that fire burns wood. I've seen that happen before. We know that bread nourishes people, that if you eat bread, you'll survive another day. And these are things, though, that you can't figure out by sitting in a room and thinking. You might be able to figure out that 3 times 5 always equals 15, but you can't figure out that fire burns wood just by sitting there and thinking. Ultimately, these are things that we have to have experienced over time and that we get some kind of regularity to. So, in other words, it's totally conceivable, right, that the sun might not rise tomorrow, right? I mean, there will come a day when the sun doesn't rise, right? Because we know that the way stars work and that they burn out over time. So it's totally conceivable that the sun won't rise tomorrow, or it's totally conceivable that there might be poisonous bread, right? Or that wet wood won't burn. Right? It's certainly these are things that the opposite is conceivable. It's just not what actually happened. So the difference between these two things is sometimes called Hume's fork, because it divides all of human knowledge into two and really only two different categories. And Hume makes a pointed observation here, and he says that everything that we claim to know has to fit into one of these two categories, either relations of ideas or be a matter of fact. And if it's not, if somebody tries to claim something that's not either just a relation of ideas, like a mathematical truth, something which is logically necessary, or if it's not something that we can ultimately say is experienceable, it's nonsense. Okay, there's nothing else that could be. It's literally just sort of words strung together. Um, so an example of that might be something like Hume would say an example of that would be something like God loves me. That's something that is not just by definition true like math, and it's not something that I could ever necessarily experience in terms of impressions. That according to Hume would be something that ultimately doesn't make sense. And I know that's a little loaded because it's a religious point, but that's going to be ultimately part of Hume's Hume's point too. Um, but other ones would be something like, things that are maybe more emotional, like something like, the color green is beautiful. And he would say, well, maybe you personally might have an experience of that, but it's not something that is necessarily true, and I might not experience it that way. So it's something that might be sort of nonsense if you try to claim that it's a fact. You can certainly say, well, yes, I experience green as beautiful, but you can't say that green is beautiful, period. That just doesn't make sense because other people might experience that differently. So things that are either everything that we say that makes sense, you would say, has to be either a relation of ideas or a matter of fact. Okay. So again, Hume points out that almost all of our reasoning in the world is about matters of fact, about how the real world works. And one thing that's interesting is that that really depends on something, on the idea of cause and effect. Okay, so when you believe that your friend is in another city because you got a letter from him, you're assuming that letters are caused by people writing them, right? Like we think, well, that happened because I know what causes those things. Or when you see smoke on the horizon and you conclude that there's a fire, you're assuming, well, I know that because I know that fire causes smoke. And almost everything that we believe about the world that we didn't directly witness comes from causal reasoning. Okay. And this makes sense, right? We haven't experienced every single thing in the world ourselves. Most things that we say that we know them because we can imagine some cause for them. But notice here's the trick. And this is where Hume is starting to really make his point. He's starting to say we can imagine causes for things based on other things that we know. But do we actually know that those things cause those things? We may really, in the end, only know that over time we can correlate all of these things. That usually, when I see fire, I've seen smoke. And I might then say, yes, fire always causes smoke. But what I'm really saying is every time that I've seen fire, I've seen smoke. But am I saying something that's logically necessary? Does fire have to cause smoke in every single case? Another one that he likes to talk about a lot is the sun rising. So I might be able to say, yes, I know that the sun will always rise in the morning because it's always risen before. But is there any logical contradiction in the sun not rising tomorrow? Is it necessarily true that the sun has to rise tomorrow? And Hume would say, no, no, there's nothing logical about it. All I'm really doing is saying that I've always seen it happen that way before. And so I'm projecting that onto the future. It's always been that way in the past. That's very, 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 very probably how it's going to be in the future. That's all he says causation is, though, and that's a trick, and that's gonna be the real catch in the next point he's going to make. So here's the thing Hume wants you to notice: we don't learn cause and effect through logic. Okay, we never can learn cause and effect through logic alone. We learn it through experience. If you had never seen fire and smoke before, no amount of pure thinking would tell you that fire produces smoke. You would have to observe it. Okay, you'd have to have seen it happen, or have somebody tell you that they've seen it before. So he also uses the example of somebody encountering water for the very first time with absolutely no prior experience of water at all. Would they be able to figure out just by looking at it that water could drown them? And his answer is no. No, there's no way just by looking at water, if you've never experienced it before, that you would know that it could drown you just by looking at it. You would have to have experienced that or be told of it. But reason alone can't get you there. And if we haven't experienced it, then where does causation fit in here? Is causation a relation of ideas, or is it a matter of fact? And he's going to say, well, causation, it's going to have to be a matter of fact because it's something that we have to have experienced. But then he's going to push on that and he's going to say, well, is causation itself something that we actually experience? That something causes something? Or when we say that something causes something, are we really just saying, I've always seen it happen this way? And that's an important question. We're going to get to that because that's the next big problem that Hume, or the first big problem that Hume's going to bring up for induction. That's where we're going to come next.